so we have one more episode to do before we get into the main reason for this series, which is the Adventist soteriology. And in this episode, we're going to go over some Adventist history. It's going to be a really quick overview and just cover some of the highlights. But I think it's important to have some vision of the history of the Adventist Church to understand kind of where things are coming from, all the issues that we have to deal with over our history, and maybe kind of get a feel for. Anyway, some of the topics we're going to discuss in the next episode. Okay, so Adventism started, as everyone familiar with the denomination knows, it started out of the Millerite movement, which predicted that Jesus would return in 1844. Adventists, of course, reinterpreted. We basically accepted Miller's predictions in terms of the way that he interpreted the prophecies and the math behind the prophecies and all that, but we reinterpreted the final event rather than them having to do with the return of Jesus, rather as interpreting it as a Jesus moving from the holy place into the most holy place within the heavenly sanctuary, which was an actual, basically the sanctuary that Moses built on earth in the wilderness and then was replicated within the Temple of Solomon. Those structures were a reflection of a sanctuary that exists in heaven, that the book of Hebrew talks about, where and Jesus is actually interceding on our behalf within that structure. And we understood 1844 to reflect that, as opposed to Jesus coming back to earth. Now, anyway, we're going to slightly discuss some of these topics, but because people familiar with Adventist theology are pretty familiar with those doctrines, I'm not going to get into them too much here, but I could always come back to them later if needed. So when the Adventist Church began, it wasn't really like one distinct people group breaking out of there, some other people group and starting their own denomination. It was actually a collection of people from all the different denominations that were around that part of the country at that time in history, because the Millerite movement was able to get through to people from many different groups. So we had people from pretty much any denomination existing at that time. And once, the disappointment happened, a lot of people more or less decided Miller was wrong. They moved on to other things. But there was a group of people that felt, hey, there really was something to Miller's predictions. There really was something to Miller's methodology. Let's figure out where he went wrong. And these people were people from many different denominational backgrounds. And as they came together and they worked through the issues regarding 1844 and Miller's predictions, and they came up with solutions to those things, they also had to deal with all the different perspectives that they were bringing to the table in terms of the rest of their theology. Because, we've already discussed that there were so many theological perspectives, so many different approaches to theology, different perspectives coming from different angles. And this group of people, if it was to survive as a new denomination, as a new group, we had to find a way to resolve some of those conflicts. And basically, these people came together and they came up with solutions to all their differences of understanding, and then they came together into basically they established a new denominational structure and became its own group. Now, the point of bringing this up is that what happened over the next few years is that as Adventism started focusing on the heavenly sanctuary, it ended up looking back at the earthly sanctuary as a model of what was happening in heaven, and recognize the fact that within the most holy place there was the Ark of the Covenant, and within it the Ten Commandments. And there was a renewed focus on the Ten Commandments that previous Christians had not paid as much attention to prior to this. And one of the key elements that stood out is the Seventh Day Sabbath, and the fact that it was one of the Ten Commandments, and it had kind of been neglected for much of Christian history. Now, as the Adventists were working through these things and looking at these new ideas and kind of developing their theology, the issue of the law, the Ten Commandment law, and issues about the law and the gospel, the law versus the ceremonial law, issues about the Sabbath and Sunday and all this stuff, these came to the forefront of the denominational attention. First, because we have to work through these ideas for ourselves and figure out exactly where we stood and how we interpreted scripture on these topics, but also because in our interactions with other Christian groups, we were confronted with objections, and we had to resolve these objections and come up with solutions and answers to them. So these things took a lot of the denomination's attention for a large part of the first few years after the group incorporated. So basically, from the 1860s, for the next 20 years or so, a lot of the discussion in Adventism had to deal with the law, it had to deal with the Sabbath, it had to deal with responding to other groups' objections about these topics. So we come to a point in our history around 1888 where more and more people are coming to realize that Adventists don't have a good understanding of the gospel. And so in 1888, we have what might be a time when there was a renewed focus in the denomination on the gospel and on Christ and bringing Christ back to the center of our theology, not because, as some people might accuse us of, because we didn't have the gospel to begin with, because we were essentially a product of all the other Protestant denominations that came into Adventism. So it's not like we invented a brand new Christian denomination that had no connection with the past. I mean, if other denominations had the gospel, then we automatically had it as well, because the people came in from those denominations. But because the focus was on the things that we had that were unique to us, and on the need to understand and explain and defend those ideas, in terms of our community, there was a shift in focus where these things kind of took precedent, and there wasn't as much of an emphasis on the gospel, on the plan of salvation. And we have a generation of people that kind of grew up in that context. So then when you get to 1888, the leaders, at least some of the leaders of the denomination, start to realize we're spending too much time on these other things and losing focus on Christ, and people are not understanding the gospel, and then they're trying to keep the law through their own strength and all these other things, and they're developing a religion that is based on a theology that is based on works, and but we're misunderstanding the plan of salvation. So we have these things happening in 1888. Then after 1888, there's a renewed emphasis on the gospel and an attempt to redirect the denominational attention to the gospel as a cornerstone of our theology. And then we get to the 1900s, and this is a period of time when the founders of the denomination, they're starting to get old and pass away. Ellen White passes away soon into the 20th century, and the denomination, and there's a lot of other things going on. I mean, the First World War is starting, and a lot of other things going on within the wider culture. And one of the elements that affects Adventism is the fundamentalist movement that we discussed in the past. So I want to take a little bit of time and look at this, just because it's a key part in the denominational history. So the Adventist community is not a static community. I mean, we have people coming in. We have new members. We do evangelistic series. People come to our meetings. They accept our message, and then they join the church. But they're coming in from other churches most often. It's usually other Christians that our message appeals to, and they come in with their own beliefs and their own backgrounds and their own perspectives, and they don't always fully understand Adventism as they come in. So people, the church is not a static community where nothing ever changes. There's always an influx of people coming in, and so on. And plus, even those members who have been in the church for a while, they're interacting with other Christians. They might read their materials, they might listen to their messages, watch them on TV or whatever. Not at that point in time in history, but there's a the Adventist community has always been a dynamic community which and had interaction with other Christians. And at this point in Christian history, especially the history of the United States, the fundamentalist movement was becoming fairly strong and fairly influential as a reaction to liberalism, which is what I mentioned in previous discussions. But the sense was that liberal Christianity is taking people so far away from traditional Christianity that it's indistinguishable from them becoming atheists or from them giving up on Christianity altogether. So one of the approaches that people took within the fundamentalist movement and within this mentality is to just intentionally close one's mind against intellectualism, against science, against information that was contrary to one's belief. So, and I could totally understand this, because there's been many people that have gone away to study theology, and the more advanced they get in their theology, the further they move away from their beliefs. They might even lose their faith in Christianity altogether, or they might come up with a version of Christianity that seems very far off. So it's understandable that other people watching this and saying, like, why would I want to go to school and study theology, or why would I want to read this book so that I could lose my faith and end up lost? I might as well just close myself off against these things and be protected. So there's I can understand why people would take this attitude towards knowledge and towards scholarship, but the reality is that people are not really protected, because you could be just as lost in your ignorance as you can be in your knowledge. So sometimes people that refuse to study, that refuse to seek a deeper understanding, end up falling for all kinds of heresies, falling for all kinds of errors, and they're just as likely to walk away from the faith in their ignorance as they are in their scholarship. So even though I don't think that's a viable solution, it's kind of the approach a lot of people took at that point in time within the wider Christian community, and it became something that influenced Adventism as well. So one of the problems, of course, is that at that point, people didn't really have the tools to respond to some of the arguments that were being brought against Christianity by some of these groups. But I believe that we're coming to a place where we do have much better tools to respond to these objections. So we're in a better position to address it now than people were back then. Now, one of the elements of I already mentioned of fundamentalism is this idea of inerrancy and of presuppositionalism, where you just essentially take the Bible to be truth, and you don't question that, and you take it as inerrant, and you just dismiss any possible objection to it because it's coming from infidels anyway. Now, again, I mentioned that one of the other things that was affecting Adventism at that time was the death of Ellen White and the pioneers. And so Adventism is being influenced by this wider fundamentalist movement, but one of the ways it affects Adventism differently than other Christians is that we take the same concepts of inerrancy that other Christians had, but we apply it not only to Scripture, but we apply it also to Ellen White. And of course, when it comes to Ellen White, there's hundreds of thousands of pages that she's written. There's all these books and all these compilations we have, and people kind of take an inerrancy approach to them, and it has a significant impact on the denomination. Now, I already explained in the previous video that we shouldn't even take that approach to Scripture itself. We should take this sort of wider contextual view of Scripture, where there is a possibility that the writers, the authors of different parts of Scripture made some mistakes, and we don't have to identify which those mistakes are, We just have to look at the big picture and make sure that what we're doing is we're following the wider trajectory of Scripture as opposed to zeroing in on any specific component. But even though we do that with Scripture as a whole, people sometimes took the same inerrancy approach that other Christians applied to the Bible, and they applied it to Ellen White, and it affected the history of our denomination for quite a while, even up to the present, in the way people approach the theology. So in a sense, we could say that Adventism has lost a significant amount of time in its ability to progress in its understanding of its own theology. So we're finally today, after 150 years after the beginning of the church, starting to understand ourselves to the point where we could explain our perspective to the outside world in a way that makes sense to them, where we could have gathered this understanding maybe more over a century ago, had it not been for this fundamentalist, anti-intellectual, anti-scholarship movement that kind of came to the church and affected the denomination the way they did so many other denominations. All right, so before we move on, there's a couple of books that have been published recently by a historian from, I'm not sure if it's from Southern or one of our institutions there, but one is on the 1919 Bible Conference, and then the other one is on the 1922 conference. And these books document the influence of fundamentalism on the Adventist church, and they shows that Adventist leaders and thought leaders in the church used the materials of other Christians from within the fundamentalist network, used their writings, published their articles in our periodicals, invited them to speak to our churches and to our our leadership meetings and things like that. So there's clear evidence that we came under the influence of these groups, and unfortunately it's affected us, and it has slowed down our own progress within our own theological attempts to develop our own theology. All right, so the next key element in Adventist history is M.L. Andreas, an Adventist theologian coming on the scene and becoming an influential theologian in the church, developing a theology known as LGT, or Last Generation Theology. And then a few decades down the line, we have the events surrounding what Adventists call questions on doctrine. So we have an individual named Walter Martin who came to the Adventist church and wanted to talk to us about, to determine if Adventism is a cult or not. And Adventists published a book, and Andreas reacted to this book, and there was a massive controversy that resulted from that interaction that affected the trajectory of Adventism ever since. Now, before I go and discuss that in a little more detail, I want to recommend a book for people that want to understand this part of our history. It's called Reactions to the Seventh Day Adventist Evangelical Conferences and Questions on Doctrines, by someone named, he usually goes by Julius Nam, but this is his actual name, which is, I'm not even sure how to pronounce, but you could look this up, and it's a dissertation that can be downloaded from various places online or found at our libraries, and it's very informative regarding this entire part of our history. So I won't go into that into much more detail. But what I want to explain here is just a little bit more about why this had such an impact on Adventist theology. So Andreas rose to the top of Adventist leadership. He was an administrator, he was a theologian, he taught at our seminaries, he was conference president in different places. So he was a fairly well-established individual in the church, and he was very influential in his theology. He was he's written books that were well known and well read by Adventist members. Now, when it comes to this particular theology called LGT or last generation theology, a lot of supporters of LGT often say that, hey, these things have been around way before Andreas, and he's not the one that came up with it. But he is the first person to provide a full theological system based on LGT. And for people that don't really understand what that means, we can use an analogy that was used from Michael Behe in his debates about evolution, but he introduced this idea of a mousetrap. You could take all the components of a mousetrap, and unless they're fixed together in a particular way, you're not going to be able to catch any mice. So unless the spring is tied to the board here, and there's some kind of trigger element, and there's some kind of hammer that comes down, it's not going to catch anything. So, somebody might say all the components of LGT were always there, in Ellen White, in the pioneers, but something doesn't become effective at having certain results until it becomes a system. Until it becomes a coherent system of thought. And Andreasen is the one that took the time to fully flesh out this idea of last generation theology and to write about it, write books about it, and to explain it. All right, so one of the things that people that have studied last generation theology don't always pick up on is the fact that Andreasen's construct is a solution to a crisis that people in that particular time in Adventist history were experiencing that we today don't really experience to the same degree. And that is the fact that they realized that Jesus wasn't coming as soon as they expected him to come. So one of the things we got to understand is that when Jesus didn't come in 1844, and then subsequently as Adventists developed the theology of the sanctuary, they understood something very important, and that is that it wasn't our place to set time anymore for the coming of Christ. God does not want us to set specific times. So what he wants us to do is to preach the message of the judgment, the three angels' messages, and to do this work, and then Jesus will come. But in the mind of all the Adventist pioneers and all the Adventists of that generation, what they imagine is that as they preach this message, Jesus will come within a very short amount of time. They expected him to come within the next 5, 10 years, 50 years, whatever it was. They pretty much all of them did not believe that they would get old and die, and that there will be other generations of Adventists in the future. So that whole generation of Adventists from 1844 all the way till the pioneers died fully expected to be alive when Jesus came. They fully expected that. Basically, the idea they had was that the investigative judgment, this Day of Atonement, this last aspect of Christ's ministry, where he went to the most holy place, that it functioned kind of like an inventory. Like if you have a business, you run your business from the time you open up in the morning, and then it's time to close at night, sometime, let's say like 8 o'clock at night. And a few minutes before you close, you do like a quick inventory, and you look over how much money you collected that day. You figure out if you lost anything, if all your products are in place, and whatever you sold and didn't sell for that day, and then you close the shop and you go home. So they viewed this last segment of history as being that kind of a inventory of whatever happened, and then Jesus would perform this last ministry that was there for him to do, and then Jesus will return and things will be over. So they had this expectation of a very soon return of Christ. And when he didn't come, and all the pioneers die off, and then Ellen White herself passes on, and you get to the 1920s, the 1930s, and that generation realizes that there's kind of a crisis here, because why is history continuing on? Like, why is it taking so long? I mean, they never expected for there to be yet another delay. They've already, Christianity has already been to a sequence of delays. I mean, the apostles expected Jesus would come in their generation, and he didn't. And then they waited and waited, and finally Miller is saying, okay, Jesus is going to come in 1844, and he doesn't come, and they're disappointed. And then they have this new revelation, and they expect he's going to come within the next few decades, within their lifetime, and he still doesn't come. And so there's this crisis building up as to why Jesus is delaying. within the context of Adventist theology, which seemed to make the case that he should be coming very soon after 1844. So Andreasen, within this crisis, he comes up with a solution, and the solution that he offers is that the reason Christ has not been able to come yet is that he needs his people to reach a certain level of victory over sin and a certain level of character perfection, so that within the wider context of the great controversy, God can demonstrate that it is possible to overcome sin, and that Satan's accusations are wrong. And in this way, he could defeat Satan, and the great controversy could be over. So basically, God needs us to gain victory over sin, so that Satan could finally be defeated and settle the great controversy. And because we as a community haven't been able to reach this level of character perfection, that means that Jesus could not return when he expected to return, and there's this delay, and because of that, we're still here, and we need to get to work and fix our characters and overcome sin, put away sin, so that Jesus could finally return. So Andreasen comes up with a system of thought that is a solution to a specific problem that was critical to them at that time, but for further generations like us, we've kind of gotten used to the idea of the delay. I mean, it's been 100 and some years, almost 200 years now, since 1844, and we've been over a century away from that time, since the time of our birth, and we're accustomed to it. But for them, it was something unexpected. It was something of a crisis, and he came up with a solution. But unfortunately, what he didn't realize is that his solution doesn't work, because it creates something that is it puts us in a theological construct that is heretical by its very nature, because it puts that last generation, that group of people at the end that overcomes sin in order to defeat Satan and win the great controversy, they become co-redeemers with Christ in a sense, because they become co-saviors. Their victory over sin is necessary for God to defeat and gain the victory and settle things within this controversy. And co-redemption is inherently heretical. So this entire construct that Andreasen came up with just doesn't work. But for whatever reason, the people of that generation didn't notice this, didn't realize the inner logic of the system and how the idea just is faulty. And instead, it ended up spreading everywhere within Adventism and affecting a good segment of the Adventist community. Now, not only is this the case, but an additional problem out of this last generation theology construct, or LGT, is that people didn't actually realize what the core of the theology was, or maybe they realized it but didn't focus on it long enough to notice the problems around it, because anytime there was a debate about last generation theology, it always revolved around other topics, which are actually subtopics. So the topics that usually come up are, what is the nature of sin? Is sin an action, or is it our nature itself? What is the nature of Christ? Does Christ have the nature of Adam after the fall or before the fall? Is it possible to reach perfection? Is it possible to live without sin? So all these issues were the issues that were always under debate, when in fact, those were not the core issues of last generation theology. The core issue was this core redemption element. And if people had taken the time to focus here, they would have said, no, this is heretical. This just cannot be. We need to get rid of this theology. But because they focused on other elements, like things like the nature of Christ and the nature of sin, these were perceived as being a lesser element. They were too abstract. They were just, advanced and abstract theological concepts that didn't really affect our daily life. And you could be just as good a Christian if you believed one way or another regarding the nature of Christ. It didn't really matter in the long term. So we just kind of decided to agree to disagree on some of these things, and we kind of overlooked them because we were focusing on the sub elements of the theology and not on the core of the theology. And unfortunately, these things kind of got overlooked for a large segment of the church's history. All right, so what happened next is, so Andreas comes up with this theology, and he writes his books, and it gets kind of passed around, and a lot of the Adventist community is already leaning in that direction, because they're already having kind of a fundamentalist mindset in how they approach Ellen White, and all these pieces kind of come together to create a sort of community that is cut up within this way of thinking. So then you move forward another decade or two, and you get to the late 1950s, early 1960s, and the Adventist denomination is contacted by Walter Martin, who is the author of the book The Kingdom of the Cults. And he was fairly popular at that time, and he would write about Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses, and a bunch of other groups in here. And he felt that he needed to include Adventists in the book The Kingdom of the Cults. But rather than just write about us without even looking into what we believe, he decided to contact the denomination, and they met with some of the Adventist leaders, and they discussed a lot of our theology. And eventually they concluded that we don't really fit within this category, because we're a lot more similar to other Protestants than they originally thought. And they basically put us in the appendix, and kind of took a lesser stance against us within this book. But when Martin came up with this, while he was working on his book, the Adventist Church came up with its own book called Questions on Doctrine, where we took the time to respond to some of the objections raised by Martin and other evangelicals, and address some of their concerns with our theology. Now, in the process of doing that, the authors of the Adventist version of the book made some statements about our theology that Andreas disagree with. For example, things like the nature of Christ, concepts regarding the atonement, whether the atonement was complete at the cross or not. Now, the thing that a lot of later theologians didn't fully understand is that these elements were only significant to Andreas because his entire construct collapsed without him. So it would not have been possible for this last generation to reach perfection and defeat Satan and win the great controversy and hasten the second coming if people don't have, if people have a sinful nature, as opposed to just being, as opposed to sin just being an outward action, or if Jesus had Adam's nature before the fall as opposed to after the fall, his construct collapsed. So that's why, if those things were true, then his construct would collapse. So because of that, Andreas cared about these issues, and they were important to him because his construct was dependent on them. So Andreas read this book, Questions on Doctrine, and he found some problems with it. He liked most of the book, but he found a few problems with it that he disagreed with on the specific points. And he wrote to the authors, and the authors kind of ignored him, and he tried again. And eventually he decided that, hey, these guys have made up their mind that they're gonna publish their stuff, even though it's wrong. And if they're not gonna pay attention to me, I'm gonna go to the churches directly. And he wrote a set of letters and sent it out to the church members. And a lot of members read them, and they said, "Oh no, Adventist leaders are apostatizing. They're moving away from the landmarks of the Adventist faith, and they're trying to make concessions, make compromises in Adventist theology to appease the evangelicals, just so they could embrace us and they could stop treating us like a cult. We're changing our theology and all this stuff." And it created this great conspiracy. Andreas created this great conspiracy regarding what was happening there, where in reality, looking at things with 2020 hindsight now, yes, the people that were working with the book of Questions on Doctrine probably did some things they shouldn't have done, and took some theological positions they shouldn't have, but the situation was nowhere near what Andreas made it out to be. And the only reason Andreas made it out to be this way is because of the baggage that he brought to the table, which was his heretical theological construct, or his own system of thought that affected his approach to theology. So Andreas starts building up this conspiracy, and the leaders apostatizing, and people buy into his ideas of the church basically walking away from the truth, or the church leaders abandoning the Adventist faith. So what happens is that the result of this conspiracy is kind of an interesting situation, because most Adventists had seen themselves as the sequence of a kind of a never-ending of coming out of previous movements. So basically, for the average Adventist, there was the Catholic Church, and then there had to be a coming out of Catholicism, and Protestantism started. And then, Protestantism went for a while, and then some new denomination had to come out of that, because people were already apostatizing, and they started a new movement. And then further down, there had to be another coming out, and eventually there's this long series of coming outs until people come out into Adventism, right? So they leave all this denomination and they join the Adventist Church, which is God's final church, final true church. So now the question is, what if the Adventist church apostatizes? What if our people move away from the pillars of the faith, so to speak? Should there be a coming out of Adventism as well? And this was one of the questions people were asking at the time of Ellen White. And Ellen White responded, no, there's never going to be a coming out of the Adventist church, because this is God's final church, and this church is going to pull through all the way to the end. So the people at this time in history, this group of people that bought into Andreas's conspiracies, they felt that all the elements were there that required a coming out, but they couldn't come out because the prophet has said not to come out anymore, not to leave this denomination anymore, because this denomination is going to make it all the way through. So what had to happen instead is they had to have an inside exodus, an internal exodus, which meant that they created, I'll come back to that point in a second, they created this exodus from within the denomination. In other words, they started forming their own groups, their own communities, their own entities that operated inside the denomination, but were still separate from the denomination as a whole, while still being part of the denomination. So we have self-supporting institutions being formed, self-supporting schools, self-supporting medical facilities, different media ministries, different groups that were doing various types of work, but were kind of separate from the denominational structure, and they had their own views and their own beliefs on a lot of these topics. And they sided with Andreas and more than with the people that wrote the QOD book, Questions on Doctrine. And they just continued to operate within the denomination. And this split within the church started some 60 years ago now, and it has continued to develop and to grow all the way to today, and it's never been undone. Even though the split happened based on faulty premises. I mean, if people really understood the problems with Andreas's theology, they would understand why he misinterpreted the situation around QOD, and he, whatever mistakes were made by the people who wrote this Question on Doctrine book, there were much better ways to address those problems than the way Andreas addressed it, and the need. There would not have been any kind of need to come out and to break away from the church or anything like that. So we have an entire movement within a movement in Adventism that has split the church in half between kind of conservatives and liberals, more or less, and it has continued on to this day. That has absolutely no basis in anything real. It's just a faulty interpretation of events by a person that have made some serious mistakes in his theological thought process, and it has affected Adventist history ever since, to the point where today, it's almost impossible to undo this separation, because people are very politically tied into their various factions in the church, and if they want to see certain things happen, they have to join forces with other people within this community, and to separate themselves from people on the opposite side, and anyway, it's a very complex situation that the church is in that is entirely the result of pretty much one individual making some very flawed theological, coming up with some very flawed theological ideas that simply just that cannot work, and in fact are heretical and extremely problematic, and yet it's affected Adventist history ever since. Okay, so because of what happened from the time of Andreas and then from during the QOD fiasco, the influence of last generation theology has affected much of the church, as all these various groups were working within the denomination of various schools. Like young people were being sent to those schools to get educated, and then they were going to various church communities and spreading the ideas of these groups and so on. And the church, the denomination as a whole, came under the influence of LGT as a result of what happened then. All right, so move forward another 20 years or so. So now we get to the time of Desmond Ford. Now, Desmond Ford, again, another very well-known theologian in the Adventist church. He's fairly influential, and he, for the first part of his life, he's very supportive of Adventism and accepts and believes Adventist theology. But he comes to a point where he, there's several incidents that it's probably not a good time to get into all the events that happened that led to this point. But essentially, Ford noticed or recognized the effects of LGT on the denomination. So he looked around and he saw a denomination that was impacted by perfectionism, by fundamentalism, that have very little assurance of salvation because they were constantly trying to, gain that perfect victory over sin so that Jesus could come. So what Ford saw was the impact, 20 years of the results of LGT on the denomination. But the way he interpreted that, or the way he diagnosed that situation, is that he thought the condition of the church was the result of the actual theology of Adventism, which is the sanctuary doctrine. So he blamed on the sanctuary what was in fact the result of last generation theology. I can't judge whether he did that purposely or it was just a mistaken analysis, but he attributed that the consequences of LGT to the Adventist sanctuary doctrine. Now, if somebody really takes the time to reason through Ford's understanding of things, he made some serious mistakes in his analysis, because what he tried to do is he tried to find the same level of assurance that somebody has who's in the once saved, always saved camp, and to apply it to the Arminian camp. Remember, we talked about the three different camps in Protestant soteriology: the Calvinists, the once saved, always saved, and the Arminians. The problem is, it is not logically possible to have the same level of assurance as an Arminian as somebody who belongs to the once saved, always saved group. And here's the reason why. Let's say we have two people. We have Jim and we have Bob. Both of them are at the same. They're the same age, and they come together. Let's just say both of them go to an evangelistic meeting, and they both accept Christ at the same time. And let's say that both of them have the same genuine new birth experience at this specific point in time, and they're both equally genuine Christians. But then you fast forward 50 years into the future, and at some point, Jim continues to grow in his Christian experience all the way to his death, but Bob continues to grow for a while, but at some point he kind of loses interest and turns away, and eventually he turns away from the faith. Okay? And let's say he's lost in the end. Because within the Arminian system, the experience of both these people has to be taken as equal, there is no way for Bob or Jim at this point in time, at the very beginning of their Christian experience, there's no way for them to know what they're going to do 50 years into the future. So because of that, there's no way for them to have the same kind of assurance as somebody in the once saved, always saved camp who cannot be lost. In their belief system, they're never going to be lost once they accepted Christ. And there's a certain type of assurance that they could have if they buy into that construct that people in the Arminian camp just cannot have. Now, somebody here would say, well, maybe the reason Bob fell away is because he never had the true Christian experience to begin with. But that's not something an Arminian can say. Only a once saved, always saved person can use that argument, or a Calvinist or somebody else. But people in the Arminian system have to acknowledge that it's possible for two people to have the exact same genuine experience, and then one of them to make it, and then another one to be lost in the end. And because of that, it's just not possible to have that level of assurance within the Arminian system. So whatever Ford was thinking, whatever he was doing, what he was proposing was simply irrational. If what he wanted to do is to promote Calvinism, he should have admitted that and say, hey, I think Calvinism is the better system. Then by all means, go join a Calvinist denomination, because these groups are always changing their mind. Like I said before, there's people here that are switching there and people there that are switching here. Whatever. If you feel like you want to switch to Calvinism, go switch to a Calvinist denomination. Adventism has no reason to switch, because the minute it switches, somebody else will come along and say, no, you got to switch to this other group. So that just wouldn't make any sense anyway. I mean, these groups have been arguing for 400 years or so. So if that's what Ford was proposing, he could have moved there. If he was proposing once saved, always saved theology, he could have switched to join the Baptist church or something else. But if he was proposing Arminian theology, it would not have been possible to have the kind of assurance he wanted Arminians to have. It's just not logically possible. Okay, so then the other question is, well, what about the sanctuary? We're the only Arminians that believe in the sanctuary, so maybe the sanctuary is wrong anyway. But again, what Ford didn't realize is that the only difference between Adventist Arminianism and the Arminianism of other denominations is that we believe in soul sleep. So for other Arminians, the judgment happens when people die, but for us, the judgment doesn't happen until the second coming. So the sanctuary construct makes sense within the Adventist framework of Arminianism and soul sleep, but it doesn't make sense for Methodist or Pentecostal or other Arminian groups, because they have to, in their way of thought, people go to heaven the minute they die, or they go to hell the minute they die. And so what's the point of having a judgment hundreds of years later when they've already been in hell for a while or in heaven? So that whole construct just falls apart. But besides that, other than this bringing together of the Arminianism as a framework and soul sleep, and putting this two together, there's no real difference between the Adventist approach to Arminianism and other people's view of Arminianism. So the sanctuary has nothing to do with it. The sanctuary doesn't affect the type of Arminianism somebody has. So essentially, his main premise, Ford's main premise or main objection against Adventism just makes no sense. It's flawed. It's a misdiagnosis. So having started here, then Ford took the next step and started basically attacking the Adventist interpretation of prophecy. He went around and said, hey, Adventists interpret Hebrews wrong because they say that he went into the most holy place, but the book of Hebrews says that Jesus went into the holy. I mean, we say that he went into the holy place when Jesus went to heaven, but the Bible in the original language says that he went into the most holy place from the very beginning. And essentially, he made it seem as if the Adventist doctrine of the sanctuary and the investigative judgment was built on a very shaky foundation. We only had a few proof texts, and there wasn't a solid basis for it. And then, of course, we have to interpret certain passages in prophecy, like Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and those passages are not as clear as we claim they are, and because of that, our entire system is flawed. But what Ford didn't realize is that these components are not the foundation for the Adventist belief. The Adventist belief is built on a much more solid foundation, and it's what we mentioned in previous videos, that we start with a certain approach to epistemology. We're following the radical Reformation trajectory, where we're trying to build theology with the Bible alone. So in that sense, we're already starting at a very different starting point than most of the Protestants. And from there, we come at things from the cosmic conflict perspective. And then from there, we come at things from the Arminian perspective. So there's all this foundational elements that affect our interpretation of other parts of prophecy, of other components of Scripture that Ford never acknowledged, never took into consideration. And because of that, his entire approach, or his entire objection here, kind of falls apart. Even when it comes to our interpretation of prophecy, because prophecies use symbols, there's different ways to interpret those symbols. And Ford never quite fully acknowledged this. And I'm going to come back to this point in the next video and explain it more thoroughly. But anyway, Ford comes on the scene. He makes his objections, and he finds his supporters, and some people even up to today continue to take his views seriously, even though if you really examine them, they're very weak theologically. In other words, I've mentioned in other videos I've put together that Ford is the theological equivalent of somebody who is responsible for gross professional negligence in some other field. Like if you went to a doctor and he amputated one leg and it turns out that he should have amputated the other, that's gross professional negligence. Well, when it comes to somebody like Ford, looking at Adventist theology and then coming up with his analysis of it, and his analysis is way off, that should be considered gross professional negligence within the field of theology. All right, so moving on from there, and coming up to the present now, because Ford's role within the church took place almost 40 years ago. The effect of Ford on the church was very interesting. So I'm going to use the same graphic to try to explain it. It might be slightly confusing at first, but if we look at Christian theology at large, we could kind of draw a line down the middle here and say, okay, people on the left side of this line are conservatives, people on the right side of this line are liberals. So, people that are within the liberal camp proper, or people that are within the neo-Orthodox camp, and there's some groups within Catholicism. Catholicism kind of straddles the line here. And then we have more traditional Protestants, and then fundamentalists. These groups are more conservative theologically, and these groups tend to be more liberal. So they tend to be more at ease with critical scholarship, with evolution and other things, while these groups try to stick more with the Christian tradition, and they tend to reject some of those more modern elements. Now, these camps, if we took all of Christian theology and broke it in two and said, okay, these groups are liberal and these groups are conservative, within Adventism, for a while, we were able to kind of stay away from this differentiation because we actually, the prophetic elements within our theology protected us from some of the arguments of the more liberal camp of theology. But the result of Ford, if we look at the church, Ford was actually represented the conservative side of evangelicalism. So his theology, at least back in the 1980s, reflected conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists. Conservative Protestants, conservative evangelicals, and other groups on the right, or the more conservative side of Christianity. So you would think that the influence of Ford on the Adventist church is that he would have people that came under his influence would become more similar to conservative evangelicalism. But what happened is the aftermath of Ford's impact on the church is that it opened the door to progressive Adventists to kind of develop plant their roots in the church. And progressive Adventists are people that are represented by the more liberal side of Christian theology. And I would argue that the reason is that the one thing that was protecting Adventism from progressive theology was the prophetic element. And this is something that Ford kind of raised doubts about, and that robbed Adventism of the protecting elements that we had in place to protect us against some of this arguments and this particular theological influence. So what we have in Adventism as a result, we're still, even like I said before, even 60 years later after QOD and 40 years after Ford, we still have the same conservative liberal split within the church, but we also have a significantly wider number of progressive Adventists who have gone quite a bit further in their approach to theology as opposed to any of the evangelical groups that reflected the evangelical perspective. Okay, so where are we today? The progressive side of the church, people that embrace a lot of the more modern elements in theology. I don't know how many details I want to get into now, but these groups, they're not, numbers-wise, they're not as big as some of the other groups in the church, like the fundamentalist Adventists or the evangelical Adventists, but they have planted themselves in key positions in Adventist universities, in hospitals, within church administration, and they have media channels that have become established as news sources for Adventists. So, the church has its own news media like the Adventist Review and other places, but usually this media is sanitized, so they don't really talk about issues in the church. They don't really get involved in controversies. So when people want to know what's actually happening, they go elsewhere for their news, and it's usually these progressive groups that run the media channels that everybody goes to for information. And in the process, they keep getting exposed to progressive ideas and to theological perspectives that are not Adventist in essence. Actually reflect the theology of other groups, whether it's the New Orthodox perspective or the liberal perspective, or Catholic or some other viewpoint. And this has become a constant source of outside influence on Adventist thinking. And of course, the funding side of the church, the people that are still supporting Andreas's views and that follow like a very fundamentalist approach to Ellen White. They have their own schools and their own media channels and their health centers, and they do their own thing, and they still have their influence on the church, and probably have the support of a much wider segment of the Adventist community. And they're still doing their thing. But one thing that is happening in the church, even though all this different elements that are pulling the church in opposite directions and away from what the church is about, even though these groups are there and they've made it difficult for people to navigate Adventism and to understand what we're about. We do live in an exciting time also, because there's a revival of real SDA scholarship, and we're starting to once again understand our place and who we are and why we exist as a group, and what perspective we're actually meant to share with the world. And so this is a great time for people to dive into Adventist theology again, and to try to make sense of the Adventist way of thinking, because we need a lot of intellectual power, a lot of brain power to be added to the church, so that we can resolve whatever still is left to resolve within Adventist theology, and to address some of the issues that still exist. Anyway, so this is kind of where we're at in Adventist history, and the point of looking over this is so we can understand why it's taken us this long as a church to really make sense of who we are and what we're about as a denomination. We've been affected by fundamentalism. We've been affected by the heretical theology of Andreas. We've been affected by Ford's faulty arguments, and with Ford came the door opening up to progressivism, which brought up a bunch of other theological perspectives within the denomination that have made it very difficult to figure out exactly what Adventism is about anymore, because everybody's pulling in all these different directions. And yet, in spite of this, there still is, and especially in the more recent years, there's a revival of SDA scholarship that is a great time to be around in, so that we can actually help and contribute and develop Adventism into the system of thought that it was intended to be originally.